Well, it's good to be back with you for another day as we are continuing on through our Advent study of the Jesse tree. If you'd like to find out more about this journey and how you can be a part, you can visit that URL right there, go.christtable.today/Jesse tree. And if you'd like to find out more about Christ Table, who we are, how you can be a part, how you can receive these resources regularly into your home, then that right there is where you need to go, www.christtable.today. Well, we find ourselves today, now finally, in the New Testament, in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14, and not a moment too soon, because we are at the very end of Advent, just a few more days until the arrival of Christmas and Jesus on the 25th. So we had better get moving and keep this story rolling, right? Because it is just around the corner. Today's ornament is a candle. And this text may be familiar if you've been in Christmas Eve services or Christmas Day services or in church at any point during your life at this time of year. Then you have probably heard John 1 read or referred to at some point. And today's ornament is the candle. So why don't we just go ahead and jump in. Now, whenever we come to John chapter 1, the book of John is, out of the four Gospels, it is very different than the rest of the four Gospels. John is a storyteller who tells the story of Jesus in a very unique way and focuses on very unique things. And this passage, though it is not a classic Luke 2 Christmas text that talks about the wise men or the shepherds or Mary and Joseph or the angels, it's still considered a Christmas or Advent text because it is kind of pulling back the curtain behind the scenes on this Jesus and the Messiah and helping us to see some of the importance and grandness of this birth and why we should be paying attention to it. So without any further delay, John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, the Word already existed, and your sensors may be going off right there, immediately thinking, I've heard that phrase before, in the beginning. And I think that's actually intentional. I think that John is actually intentionally building a bridge between the story that he wants to tell about this individual Jesus and the story that the Hebrew texts tell in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. John says in the beginning, the Word already existed. So we have this intentional connection here that is just unavoidable between creation and between what John is about to tell us about Jesus. So in the beginning, the Word, translated there is logos, and we take that to mean Jesus. In the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so this is one of those moments that are a pinpoint that give us standing for saying that this birth that John is about to talk about, this individual, is not just human, but is also God. He existed in the beginning with God, John says, and God created everything through him. So there is a lot packed in here to a few words about Jesus. And so John is making the case that though Jesus first shows his face in Bethlehem of Judea, and we celebrate that on December 25th as Mary gives birth to this Christ child, that was not the beginning of Christ. That was not the beginning of Jesus. He existed for a long time before that arrival in Bethlehem. And the Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. Now you can see why the candle today is our symbol, our image for the day. And what John has done here now in this passage is he has connected this light to life and life to light. And you see this kind of circle of connection being created where John is saying to us that this light means life. And so this darkness is both very real that John is talking about, and also very metaphorical. It's very practical, and it's also very spiritual. So fascinating here, and important for us to remember that John immediately says that Jesus is the light of the world, and that that light pushes away the darkness, and that that light also is life, which is kind of implying that without life, without the life and the light of Jesus, then there is darkness within humanity as well. So that light shines in the darkness. The darkness can never extinguish it. That word never is going to become important to us in just a moment. God sent a man, John the Baptist, to tell about the light so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. So what John is doing here, and I know that we just heard John the Baptist, these are two different Johns. John, who's writing this text, is not the same John as John the Baptist. But John, who is writing this text in the gospel, has now connected Jesus to the infinite past and the infinite future. You know, he said that this light is Jesus. This Jesus is God, and he was there in eternity past. But he's also now said that this light can never be extinguished, which means that the darkness will never win because this light will always be in effect. It will always remain. And so John has essentially now taken Jesus, and he has tied Jesus all the way to the infinite past, through and before creation, and has taken Jesus all the way to the infinite future, all the way to the end of eternity. And so he is, again, setting up this idea here that this birth, this Luke 2 Bethlehem arrival of a baby is not just some other human being, but is God himself. So let us now continue in the passage, verse 8. John himself was not the light. He was simply a witness to tell about the light. The one who is the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. And so some people, we know, during this period of time mistook John as being the one who was promised. That is something that we know. So this was a huge deal, because there were a lot of people who mistook John for being the Messiah, for being Jesus. Well, why is that? Because John looked a lot like what they expected the Messiah to look like, the promised one. John looked like an Old Testament prophet. John came preaching repentance. John the Baptist came and seemed like somebody who was an outsider and talked a lot about government and powers and those things. And so there was this danger that people would see John the Baptist as being the Messiah. But no, John is saying John the Baptist was just here to point towards the one. And John knew that, and Jesus knew that. And so John himself wasn't the light. He was simply a witness to tell about the light. And I think that we still make this mistake, not necessarily about mistyping John as being the Messiah, but I think a lot of times that we forget that we are simply here in a lot of ways to simply represent the light. We are not the light. We are not the one who is calling people to repentance or shouting people down. We're not the center of the spiritual universe, but there is another one who is, and that one is Jesus. And we are simply here to be a witness, to tell our story of how that light has pushed out the darkness within us, to witness to that to other people. The one who is the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. And so you can kind of feel that Advent arrival just on the horizon. It's coming. Jesus is coming, John says. He came into the very world that he created, but the world didn't recognize him. Now we take a turn here, and John says, we should have We should have noticed who this was. We should have recognized him, but a lot of people didn't. He even came to his own people, and they rejected him. But to all who believed and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They're reborn, not with physical birth, resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. And I love this final verse for today. So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. This idea that the word, translation of the word logos, we understand to mean Jesus, that Jesus, God, this divine human, fully God, fully man, 100% of each, not 50-50, but 100% God, 100% human, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? To think about that God would become fully human and make his home among us. The word that's used here is an important word. It's a word that oftentimes is translated, and maybe your version says this, it's oftentimes translated tabernacled or tinted. It has this strong connection back to the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures where there was the tabernacle that was set up as a place where God would come and visit and be, but then also would leave from. And this idea even was present way back then that the tabernacle could not and did not contain God. His presence was there for a time and then it was gone. And this is the idea that's being conveyed here, is that for a time, God decided to come and physically tabernacle among us. There's another translation of that word that I love that is completely valid in Hebrew and Greek, and it's this idea of tinted, a tent, like that God came up and set a tent up among us. I think that there's so much metaphor and story wrapped up in the idea of a tent, because I think compared to the power and majesty of God and the constraints and difficulties of being human, there's quite a difference. Not unlike, in fact, this is maybe a woeful comparison because it still doesn't reach the heights of the difference between what it meant from going to being fully God to now being fully God and fully human, wrapped up in this body, this tent. The difference between a compound, living in a mansion, the White House, living in the grandest estate that you can think of, the Biltmore, versus a two-person tent bought from Walmart. When you think of it in that way, that God was willing to step out of the Biltmore and into a tent, we begin to understand, I think, the love and the passion and the care with which God truly feels about humanity. And we begin to understand the lengths to which he was willing to go, that God was willing to go to fulfill those promises. As we walk through this journey of Advent, one of the questions in our mind, one of the questions in Israel's mind for for generations, for centuries, even for thousands of years, was, is God truly going to fulfill his promises? There were still question marks around this promise from Noah with the rainbow. There were still question marks around these promises to Abraham about land and about blessing. There were still question marks in their minds about David and whether or not the kingdom would be restored or could be restored. It was in such desolation. And this passage, this text, this word made his home among us, made his tabernacle among us, made his tent among us, is communicating in vibrant and powerful language the lengths to which God will go to make things right and to keep his promises. Until tomorrow.